She was the voice behind an era. Irene Cara didn't just sing songs, she gave the world an anthem. From Fame in 1980 to Flashdance, What a Feeling in 1983, her voice carried the dreams of a generation. She won an Oscar, a Grammy, and a Golden Globe, yet somehow the industry turned its back on her. How does someone so gifted, so iconic, end up underrated and silenced? Was it bad contracts, powerful enemies, or simply a cruel twist of fate? Her story is one of triumph, betrayal, and resilience. Irene Cara should have been celebrated forever, but instead she became a cautionary tale. Let's get into her story right now. Irene Cara was born on the 18th of March 1959 in the Bronx, New York City, a borough that has produced countless legends but rarely gives them an easy start. Her father, Gaspar Cara, was an Afro-Puerto Rican factory worker and musician, and her mother, Louise Escalera, was a Cuban-American movie theater usher. That mix of cultures, Puerto Rican rhythms, and Cuban melodies, wrapped in the energy of New York, flowed straight into Irene's veins. She was the youngest of 5 children, the little spark in a busy, working-class household where music was always in the air. The Bronx in the late 1950s was tough. It was noisy, crowded, and full of contradictions. Poverty and crime walked hand in hand with creativity and resilience. Gospel choirs filled storefront churches, block parties spilled onto the streets, and Latin jazz poured out of neighborhood clubs. This was the soundtrack of Irene's childhood. Instead of silencing her, the struggle of her surroundings sharpened her gifts. She was humming before she could even speak clearly, mimicking melodies she heard on the radio, banging out rhythms on whatever surface was nearby. Her parents noticed early that Irene was different. While other kids were running around, she was glued to the television whenever a singer appeared on screen. By age 3, she was singing full songs with pitch and emotion far beyond her years. Gaspar, himself a frustrated musician, encouraged her talent. Louise enrolled Irene in dance classes, piano lessons, and vocal training. This wasn't easy, money was always tight, but her parents believed she had something rare. At just 5 years old, Irene began competing in local talent shows, leaving audiences stunned at how such a tiny girl could project such a powerful voice. Her big break came when she started appearing on Spanish-language television programs, performing for audiences that instantly fell in love with her. Soon, she was a regular face on TV variety shows, singing boleros and pop standards, and gaining confidence in front of the camera. She became known in her community as the little girl with the grown-up voice. But Irene wasn't just about singing. She was a natural performer. Her dance teachers described her as electric, a child who could light up a stage the moment the spotlight hit. She absorbed ballet, tap, and jazz dance with the same ease she picked up songs. By the time she was 8, she was already a triple threat singer, dancer, actress, without even realizing she was doing something extraordinary. Her early education at the professional children's school in Manhattan further shaped her. Surrounded by other young performers, Irene learned discipline and the grind of show business. She began auditioning for commercials, jingles, and Broadway productions. She even recorded a Spanish-language album of popular songs, which showcased her bilingual skills and cemented her reputation as a prodigy. Irene's childhood wasn't just about talent and applause. There was also the quiet pressure of being different in a world that didn't always value her heritage. Afro-Latinas were rarely celebrated in mainstream entertainment during that era. Casting directors often didn't know what to do with her look, her accent, or her background. Too often she was told she wasn't enough of one thing or another, not white enough for certain roles, not black enough for others, and not Latina enough for stereotypes Hollywood liked to sell. But instead of letting that crush her spirit, Irene used it to fuel her determination. Her resilience paid off. By the age of 10, she landed roles in off-Broadway musicals and became a frequent guest on children's shows. She appeared in The Electric Company, rubbing shoulders with other young talents. Her sweet but commanding presence set her apart. It was clear to everyone who saw her that this was a child destined for stardom. Still, Irene's path was not without its sacrifices. Her siblings lived relatively normal lives, while she spent hours rehearsing, commuting to Manhattan, and juggling school with auditions. She often felt torn between two worlds, the world of a Bronx kid hanging out with friends and the world of an aspiring starlet surrounded by adults, agents, and showbiz chatter. That duality shaped her personality, giving her both toughness and vulnerability. Looking back, her early life was a perfect storm. She had the raw gift, the supportive parents, the cultural melting pot of New York, and the stage experience that most performers don't get until adulthood. But woven into that bright beginning was also the seed of a lifelong struggle, being seen for who she truly was. Even as a child prodigy, Irene Cara was already learning that talent alone wouldn't guarantee acceptance in an industry built on narrow definitions of beauty and success. And yet, in those early years, nothing could dim her light. She was a Bronx girl with a dream and the fire to chase it. Every time she stepped on stage, people saw a glimpse of the star she would become. For Irene, the story was only just beginning. As Irene Cara moved from childhood into her teenage years, she was no longer just the cute little girl with a big voice. She was becoming a polished performer. By the early 1970s, she was already navigating the world of professional auditions in New York City, a place filled with hungry talent and tough gatekeepers. But Irene had something that couldn't be taught: charisma. Her first steady work came from television. She landed roles on The Electric Company, the educational children's series that also featured young talents like Morgan Freeman and Rita Moreno. For a girl barely in her teens, sharing a set with professionals was a masterclass in acting and stage presence. She also appeared in a string of commercials, lending her bright smile and warm energy to household brands. These early gigs didn't make her a superstar, but they gave her exposure and discipline. Music, however, was always her strongest weapon. Irene recorded jingles and small projects that circulated in New York's Latin music community. Her bilingual skills allowed her to cross into Spanish-language markets, which gave her an edge over many of her peers. Around this time, she recorded an album in Spanish aimed at the Latin American audience. While the project didn't chart globally, it showed Irene's range and introduced her to audiences outside the United States. Acting opportunities soon followed. In 1975, she made her film debut in Aaron Love's Angela, a gritty love story often described as a Black Romeo and Juliet. Irene played the female lead, and while the movie didn't break box office records, it showcased her ability to handle serious dramatic roles. Critics noted that Cara brought both vulnerability and strength to the screen, a balance that would later define her career. For a teenager, carrying a feature film was no small feat, and she did it with natural confidence. At the same time, she remained active in theater. Irene appeared in Broadway and off-Broadway productions, sharpening her stagecraft. She worked on musicals that demanded live singing, dancing, and acting all in one performance. Night after night, she proved she could handle the intensity of professional theater. This was the training ground that separated hobbyists from true professionals, and Irene was proving she belonged in the latter category. Her ability to blend music and acting made her a rare commodity. She could deliver emotional dialogue one moment and belt out a soulful ballad the next. Directors noticed, and casting calls for young roles often had Irene's name in the mix. Still, breaking through in the 1970 entertainment industry was not simple. The industry's biases against Afro-Latina performers meant that opportunities were often limited, and Irene had to work twice as hard to even be considered. But each role, each performance, added another layer to her reputation. In New York, she was becoming known as the girl who could do it all. She was no longer just a child prodigy, but a serious young artist ready for bigger stages. Even if mainstream fame hadn't arrived yet, Irene Cara was steadily laying the foundation for something much larger. By the time she was in her late teens, Irene had already built a resume that most adults would envy. Singer, dancer, actress, film star, and Broadway veteran. The Bronx girl who once sang in neighborhood talent shows was now a professional entertainer with undeniable momentum. The seeds of stardom were planted, and all it would take was the right role, the right song, and the right moment to make the world see what she had been preparing for all along. By the mid-1970s, Irene Cara's name was circulating in casting offices, and her face was becoming familiar to television viewers. Yet her next step would be the one that began to carve her into popular culture. That moment came with the 1976 film Sparkle. Sparkle told the story of three sisters in Harlem who form a singing group, rise to fame, and then struggle with the dark side of the music business. Although Irene's singing voice was used primarily on the soundtrack rather than in on-screen performances, Since the film featured actress Lonette McKee in the lead, her connection to Sparkle tied her to a cult classic. Fans remember her vocals on songs like This Is It and Hooked on Your Love, tracks that carried the raw emotion of gospel and soul. For a teenager, contributing to such a soundtrack was a major step. It also hinted at a theme that would follow Irene's career. She could provide the voice that moved people, even if she wasn't always the one in the spotlight. Her presence in Sparkle coincided with a surge of work in television movies. Irene appeared in productions like Guyana Tragedy, The Story of Jim Jones, 1980, where she portrayed one of the doomed followers in the infamous Jonestown cult story. These roles demanded emotional depth and proved that she wasn't limited to musicals or teen dramas. Casting directors began to see her as versatile, capable of carrying both light entertainment and heavy drama. At the same time, Irene was growing as a live performer. She headlined cabaret shows, performed at cultural events in New York, and built a reputation in entertainment circles as a powerhouse on stage. Audiences often left her performances stunned, wondering why such a talented young woman wasn't already a household name. Industry insiders whispered that she had it, the charisma, the voice, the presence, but she still lacked that one definitive breakout project. That breakout was slowly approaching. In the late 1970s, Irene joined the cast of the short-lived series Roots, The Next Generations, appearing alongside stars like Diane Carroll. For many viewers, it was their first chance to see Irene act in a high-profile television event connected to one of the most important cultural milestones of the decade. Even if her role wasn't the largest, it showed she could stand in the same frame as giants and hold her own. What tied all these experiences together was Irene's steady growth. She had become a veteran before she even hit 21. She had the polish of Broadway, the resilience of a Bronx upbringing, and the kind of determination that only comes from years of fighting to be seen. She wasn't just another young actress hoping for a lucky break. She was someone who had been training for that moment since she was a child. By 1979, Irene was perfectly positioned. She had the skills, the look, and the hunger. All she needed was a platform big enough to show the world what she could do. That opportunity was about to arrive in the form of a movie and a soundtrack that would change her life forever. The turning point in Irene Cara's career arrived in 1980 with the release of Fame. If Sparkle hinted at her potential, Fame blew the door wide open. Cast as Coco Hernandez, the ambitious and fiercely talented student at New York's High School of Performing Arts, Irene finally had the platform she had been waiting for. This was not just another role, it was the role that seemed tailor-made for her own life story. As Coco, Irene portrayed a character who embodied the hunger, grit, and vulnerability of young artists fighting for recognition. The parallels to her real life were striking. She, too, had been the Bronx girl with big dreams, navigating rejection, sacrifice, and the pressure to succeed in a world that often dismissed her. Audiences connected instantly. Critics praised her for bringing authenticity and raw energy to the part. For once, Irene wasn't in the shadows or providing background vocals, she was front and center. The soundtrack of Fame carried her voice to even greater heights. She recorded two of the film's signature songs, Fame and Out Here on My Own. Both tracks became anthems for dreamers everywhere. Fame, with its defiant chorus about living forever and making one's mark, captured the spirit of the era. Out Here on My Own, a tender ballad of loneliness and perseverance, showcased Irene's ability to convey vulnerability through her voice. That song earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Song, making history as one of the first times two songs from the same film were nominated. The success of Fame was immediate and global. The film grossed millions at the box office. The soundtrack went platinum, and suddenly Irene Cara was a star. Teenagers painted her face on posters. Young girls mimicked her dance routines, and aspiring singers clung to every lyric she sang. Coco Hernandez became an icon, and Irene Cara was forever linked to the dream of making it in the arts. Yet even in this moment of triumph, hints of the underrated narrative began to emerge. While Fame was celebrated as a cultural phenomenon, much of the mainstream spotlight went to the brand itself, the school, the ensemble cast, the idea of fame rather than to Irene herself. Some critics described the movie as an ensemble piece where no single star stood out, despite Irene's undeniable contributions. Others pointed out how the music industry failed to capitalize on her rising momentum with proper marketing and promotion. Still, Irene's influence was undeniable. Fame became more than just a song. It was a rallying cry for anyone chasing their dreams. Dance studios across the world blasted it through their speakers, and the phrase, "I'm gonna live forever," entered popular vocabulary. Irene was now a voice of empowerment, particularly for young women and performers of color who rarely saw themselves represented on screen in such a bold and aspirational way. But the industry is fickle. Even at the height of fame, Irene felt the pressures of being typecast and undervalued. She had proven she could lead a film, carry songs to the top of the charts, and inspire a generation. Yet Hollywood and the recording industry were already hesitating to give her the next big opportunity. The seeds of struggle were being planted even as she stood in the brightest spotlight of her career. For the moment, though, Irene Cara was on top. The Bronx girl had gone from neighborhood talent shows to global stardom, and the world seemed ready to embrace her. What no one knew then was that an even bigger moment was waiting just a few years down the road, one that would cement her legacy forever. If fame launched Irene Cara into the spotlight, it was Flashdance. What a feeling in 1983 that turned her into a legend. The song, co-written by Giorgio Moroder, Keith Forsey, and Irene herself, was the theme for the hit movie Flashdance. From the opening beat, what a feeling pulsed with energy, ambition, and joy. It wasn't just a song for a movie, it was a song for an era. The lyrics told the story of chasing dreams, of holding on to belief even when the world doubts you. Irene's voice soared with passion, blending vulnerability with pure power. When she sang, "Take your passion and make it happen," listeners believed her. It was as if she wasn't just performing, she was testifying. The anthem resonated across generations, gyms, dance studios, and radio stations. What a feeling! Became one of the most recognizable pop songs of the decade. The success was staggering. The single hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and stayed there for 6 consecutive weeks. Irene Cara won the Academy Award for Best Original Song, the Grammy Award for Best Female Pop Vocal Performance, and the Golden Globe Award for Best Original Song. For a young Afro-Latina woman from the Bronx, this was history. She had climbed to the absolute peak of music and film recognition, a triple crown that few performers ever achieve. But even in triumph, the shadows of injustice lingered. Some in the industry questioned whether she was truly the creative force behind the song, downplaying her role in writing the lyric. Others whispered that Irene's success was a fluke, tied only to the movie rather than her talent. The very institutions that celebrated her also seemed eager to limit her. Instead of launching her into a long career of chart-topping hits, the industry hesitated. Her record label failed to properly promote her follow-up projects, and whispers of contract disputes began to circulate. Despite these obstacles, the cultural impact of "What a Feeling" was undeniable. It became the soundtrack of ambition. Athletes, dancers, and everyday people adopted it as their motivational anthem. From high school gyms to Olympic training montages, the song inspired people to push through struggle and chase greatness. Irene Cara's voice became synonymous with hope and empowerment. Her visibility as an Afro-Latina star was also groundbreaking. At a time when representation was scarce, Irene showed that someone who looked like her could dominate the charts and walk away with Hollywood's biggest trophies. She inspired young artists from diverse backgrounds, proving that the path to success, though narrow and unfair, was possible. By the mid-1980s, Irene Cara should have been untouchable, positioned as one of the biggest stars in the world. Yet the very forces that had elevated her were also beginning to conspire against her. Industry politics, contractual battles, and the unwillingness of record executives to fully back her career planted seeds of conflict that would later derail her momentum. Still, during this period, Irene was at the pinnacle of her influence. She had already secured her place in history. She was the voice of fame and the fire behind Flashdance. She had lived the dream that so many only fantasized about. And yet, the haunting question remained, why didn't this level of success translate into lasting superstardom? The answer would unfold in the struggles and heartbreaks that followed. For most artists, winning an Oscar, a Grammy, and a Golden Globe in the same breath would mark the beginning of a long golden era. For Irene Cara, it marked the start of her downfall. The very system that should have lifted her up instead became the force that pulled her down. Behind the scenes, Irene was embroiled in a bitter contractual dispute with her record label, Network Records, and its head, Al Khoury. According to reports, the label had withheld royalties, mismanaged her projects, and locked her into unfair terms. Irene, unlike many artists who chose silence to preserve their careers, decided to fight back. She filed a lawsuit for unpaid earnings and spoke openly about the shady practices of the industry. That decision, though courageous, came with devastating consequences. In an industry built on connections and gatekeepers, speaking out was often treated as betrayal. Almost overnight, Irene's career momentum slowed. Record executives whispered that she was difficult, a coded word often used against women who dared to challenge authority. Radio stations stopped giving her songs the same rotation. Projects that once seemed promising suddenly dried up. The lawsuit dragged on for years, draining Irene's energy and finances. She eventually won a multi-million-dollar settlement, but by the time the judgment came, the damage to her career was already done. Winning in court didn't translate to winning in the industry. She had been labeled, quietly and powerfully, as someone to avoid. This was the cruel paradox. Irene Cara had the voice, the awards, the fan base, and the charisma, but she was fighting battles most listeners never saw. The very act of standing up for herself, a move that should have been admired, became the reason she was blackballed. Other artists would later describe similar experiences, but Irene was one of the earliest high-profile cases. Her story became a cautionary tale whispered in rehearsal studios. Don't rock the boat, or you'll end up like Irene Cara. The emotional toll was heavy. Irene had gone from standing in front of the world, clutching an Oscar, to struggling to get her songs released. Imagine the whiplash. One moment you're the face of empowerment, the next you're locked out of the very stage you helped build. For someone who had been performing since childhood, this wasn't just about losing work. It was about losing her identity. By the mid-1980s, the cracks in her career were impossible to ignore. She continued to record music, but without strong promotion or industry support, her albums barely registered. She appeared in smaller television projects and independent films, but none carried the weight of her earlier triumphs. The industry had closed its doors, and Irene was left knocking from the outside. For fans who had danced to fame and felt invincible listening to What a Feeling, it was confusing. How could someone with so much talent and such recent success vanish so quickly? The answer lay not in her voice, but in the power games of the business. Irene Cara wasn't defeated by her art, she was defeated by the machine. The legal battles left scars that went far beyond the courtroom. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Irene Cara was living in a strange limbo, famous enough that everyone knew her name, but sidelined enough that new opportunities rarely came. For an artist who had once symbolized unstoppable ambition, the silence was deafening. Industry whispers painted her as uncooperative, a troublemaker. Those labels were especially damaging for a woman of color in Hollywood. Men who fought back against unfair contracts were often called shrewd. Women were called difficult. Irene became one of the many examples of double standards that still plague the entertainment world. She tried to keep her career alive. She released albums in the mid-1980s, including Charismatic, but without the promotional push of a major label, the projects were virtually invisible. Radio DJs who once spun her records now moved on to the next pop sensation. Concert opportunities dwindled. For fans, it was heartbreaking to watch a voice that had once filled arenas fade into the background. There were other attempts to stay in the public eye. Irene appeared in films like DC Cab in 1983, performing the song The Dream, Hold On to Your Dream. The track was upbeat, hopeful, and perfectly matched her own spirit of resilience. But the movie came and went without leaving much of a mark, and the song didn't chart the way her earlier hits had. For many, it was a reminder of what could have been if she'd been given consistent support. As the years passed, Irene's absence from the spotlight fueled rumors. Tabloids speculated about her finances, her mental health, and her relationships. She was painted as a recluse who had fallen from grace, though the truth was more complicated. Irene was still working, writing, recording, and occasionally performing, but the industry that once couldn't get enough of her now acted as if she no longer existed. The emotional toll of this erasure was heavy. Friends recalled that Irene struggled with the whiplash of going from global fame to isolation. She had been on the cover of magazines, cheered on red carpets, and honored on the world's biggest stages. Now she was fighting to remind people that she was still here, still capable, still burning with the same fire. There were brief flashes of recognition. In the 1990, she won a lawsuit that affirmed her fight for fair royalties, a moral victory even if it came too late to rebuild her career. She also toured internationally, where fans in Europe and Asia continued to celebrate her. But in the United States, the silence was deafening. By the time reality TV shows like Gone Country cast her in the 2000s, Irene was introduced to younger audiences more as a nostalgic name than an active star. Watching her on those shows was bittersweet. Viewers could see glimpses of the charisma and talent that had once made her unstoppable, but they also saw a woman worn down by years of battles with an unforgiving industry. For Irene, the conflict phase of her life was defined not by a lack of talent, but by an environment determined to erase her. The saddest part? The very voice that had once symbolized triumph and empowerment was muted by forces beyond her control. When the spotlight dimmed on Irene Cara's career, her influence didn't fade, it simply moved underground, becoming a foundation for the artists who followed. Even if the mainstream industry tried to erase her, the echoes of her work continued to inspire dancers, singers, and dreamers across the world. Her greatest impact can be measured in the artists who cite her as a trailblazer. Jennifer Lopez, another Bronx-born Latina, has spoken about the power of seeing women like Irene break into mainstream entertainment. Before Lo became a global icon, Irene Cara had already shown that a young Latina from New York could top the charts, star in films, and win Hollywood's biggest prizes. In many ways, Irene cracked open the door that Lopez and others later walked through. Mariah Carey, too, drew inspiration from Irene's blend of emotional vulnerability and technical strength. When Carey delivered soaring ballads in the 1990s, you could hear shades of Irene's ability to pour raw feeling into every note. Beyoncé's own brand of empowerment anthems, songs that combine personal grit with universal inspiration, carry a spiritual connection to Irene's What a Feeling. Without Irene laying the groundwork, it's hard to imagine the same path existing for these later superstars. Her role as an Afro-Latina in mainstream entertainment also carried enormous weight. Representation mattered, even if it wasn't celebrated at the time. Young Afro-Latina girls could look at Irene and see someone who reflected their identity on the world stage. She wasn't just singing songs, she was proving that their stories, voices, and faces belonged in the cultural conversation. Beyond individual artists, Irene's music shaped entire cultural movements. Fame became the anthem for performing arts schools, inspiring countless students to pursue their dreams no matter how impossible they seemed. Every time a teenager stood in front of a mirror, hairbrush in hand, belting out, "I'm gonna live forever," they were channeling Irene Cara's energy. What a Feeling transcended generations. Coaches used it in locker rooms, choreographers blasted it in rehearsals, and ordinary people played it before job interviews or big life moments. The song's message, "Take your passion and make it happen," became more than lyrics. It was a life philosophy. Irene gave people the soundtrack to push through fear and doubt, even if they didn't know her full story. Academically, her contributions are now studied in discussions of women in music, Afro-Latina identity, and the politics of representation in Hollywood. Scholars note how her career highlights both the possibilities and limitations of breaking barriers in a prejudiced industry. She is celebrated as someone who achieved monumental success, yet was still systematically undermined, a reminder of how talent alone can't always protect against systemic inequities. On stage, her legacy lived on through tribute performances and covers. Younger artists covered her songs at talent shows and reality competitions, reintroducing her catalog to new audiences. Each time Out Here on My Own was sung by a hopeful contestant on American Idol or The Voice, Irene's spirit was quietly present. Even as her name disappeared from headlines, the DNA of Irene Cara's artistry ran through the veins of popular culture. She was, in many ways, a bridge between disco and pop, between film and music, between Latin identity and African-American heritage. She proved that a single voice could carry all those complexities and still touch the world. In the end, Irene's legacy wasn't confined to awards or chart numbers. It lived in the inspiration she gave to others. Whether it was a little girl in the Bronx dreaming of the stage, or a superstar like Beyoncé claiming her space at the top, they all stood on the shoulders of Irene Cara. When Irene Cara passed away in November 2022 at the age of 63, the world was reminded of just how deeply she had touched culture. News outlets rushed to revisit her achievements, and social media exploded with tributes. Fans who had grown up in the 1980 and 1990 shared stories of dancing in their bedrooms to Flashdance. What a feeling. Younger fans, who had discovered her music through TikTok clips or retro playlists, expressed shock that such a powerful voice had ever been sidelined. In the days following her death, What a Feeling and Fame surged again on streaming platforms. It was a bittersweet moment, proof that her songs were timeless, but also a reminder that she never received the consistent recognition she deserved while alive. For many, it felt like a rediscovery. They remembered how her music had made them feel invincible, and they wondered why she wasn't mentioned more often alongside legends like Donna Summer or Whitney Houston. Her passing also sparked conversations about the systemic challenges that had stunted her career. Music journalists revisited the details of her lawsuits and the blackballing she endured, framing her not just as a star but as a symbol of resistance. They pointed out that Irene Cara had dared to demand fairness in an era when few women of color could risk speaking out. In that sense, her legacy became not only about music but also about courage. Comparisons to other legends further underscored her underrated status. Marvin Gaye and Sam Cooke are celebrated as voices of generations. Donna Summer is hailed as the queen of disco. Irene Cara stood shoulder to shoulder with them in terms of cultural impact, yet she was often absent from the same lists. The conversations after her death asked a haunting question. If Irene had been fully supported by the industry, would she have stood permanently in that pantheon? Many fans insisted the answer was yes. Her songs continued to find life in new contexts. What a Feeling has been featured in commercials, talent competitions, and countless viral videos. It has become shorthand for triumph. Out Here on My Own remains a go-to audition piece for young singers who want to showcase both vulnerability and power. Every time the songs reappear, Irene Cara's spirit re-enters the cultural bloodstream. What makes her legacy especially powerful is the way it spans across identities and generations. She was Afro-Latina, Bronx-born, a child prodigy who became a global icon. She represented possibility to those who rarely saw themselves in Hollywood or on Billboard charts. And her music didn't just belong to one group, it belonged to anyone chasing a dream. That universality is why her songs still resonate. Even though Irene never enjoyed the sustained career she deserved, her legacy refuses to be erased. In fact, her story has grown more important in hindsight. She is a reminder that greatness can be overlooked in its time, but never extinguished. The industry may have tried to silence her, but fans, dancers, singers, and everyday dreamers keep her voice alive. Irene Cara's legacy is proof that influence cannot always be measured by longevity or chart statistics. Sometimes it's measured by the way a single song can change the way people see themselves. And in that sense, Irene Cara lives forever. From the streets of the Bronx to the brightest stages in Hollywood, Irene Cara's story is one of dazzling triumph and heartbreaking injustice. She embodied the dream that so many chased talent discovered early, success earned through years of hard work, and a voice that could stop people in their tracks. For a brief, shining moment, she had it all. She gave the world anthems of ambition and resilience. Fame, Out Here on My Own, and Flashdance, What a Feeling. Those songs were not just hits. They were lifelines for people searching for hope. And yet, the industry that benefited from her brilliance also turned its back on her. Her battles over contracts and royalties, her refusal to stay silent in the face of exploitation, and the quiet blackballing that followed serve as painful reminders of how talent can be crushed by power. Irene was not defeated by her voice. It never failed her. She was defeated by an industry too, threatened to let her soar freely. But if the business tried to erase her, the culture refused. Fans still sing her words, dancers still move to her rhythms, and dreamers still whisper her lyrics before chasing their own goals. That is the paradox of Irene Cara. Underrated by executives, unforgettable to the people. The question lingers. Should Irene Cara be remembered alongside legends like Donna Summer, Marvin Gaye, and Whitney Houston. Many would argue she belongs right there, shoulder to shoulder. What do you think? Does she deserve a permanent place in that hall of greatness, or was she destined to remain a cult hero for those who know? No matter the answer, her spirit lives on. The awards on her shelf may gather dust, but the fire she lit continues to burn in every person who takes their passion and makes it happen. Irene Cara may have been silenced too soon, but in truth, she will live forever.